Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zubko. Today we are examining Mongolia's energy security challenges and opportunities through some critical questions that explore how a landlocked nation located between Russia and China navigates fuel dependence, renewable potential, and geopolitics of pipelines while managing coal transition, climate vulnerabilities, and the quest for strategic autonomy. My guest today is Telmen Altanshagai. Hello?
Hi, good to be here.
Telmen Altanshagai is a Washington, D.C.-based independent policy analyst, energy and climate intern at Observer Research Foundation America, and also Global Policy Institute Fellow, as she's specializing in energy security and development economics across the Global South, with particular expertise and interest in Mongolia, where her research examines how the global energy transition shapes the country's economic stability and long-term development trajectory. So let's start with the first question. And I think Mongolia, for many people, is slightly mysterious and unknown. So logically, the first question is, how would you characterize Mongolia's current energy mix and energy security profile?
Great question to start. And again, thanks for the nice invitation. I'm very happy to be here. And, question of Mongolia, energy security is, as you mentioned, oftentimes underdeveloped topic in world of geopolitics or geopolitics of energy. And let's discuss it. I would say, because of the location of the country, neighboring two gigantic players in the world order, Russia and China, it's quite complex as the country is solely dependent on Russian petroleum products, and its economy is dependent on Chinese interest to buy Mongolia's coking coal. So it's a very unique situation, I would argue, even though the country has a lot of energy resources such as minerals as well as coal. The country itself lacks petroleum products to run its transportation and aviation system. So whenever we talk about energy versus electricity, it can be a little niche topic for average people to understand. Um, in terms of electricity, country's electricity system is run by coal based power plants. I would say close to 90%, and some renewable energy, which is less than 10%. So that's the Mongolia's electricity supply. But when we talk about energy supplies, energy, it touches on many different forms of energy, whether it's electricity, whether it's transportation systems, so petroleum products, it's different. And so according to IEA, in 2023, I believe I have numbers, 76% of Mongolia's energy supply came from coal, 20 something came from petroleum-based products such as gas and regular fuel for transportation system, as well as a little bit of renewable energy and biofuels. So there's got to be distinction when we talk about these things. So electricity, heavily coal-based, but when it comes to energy supply, oil as well as coal.
Mongolia imports nearly all its refined petroleum products from Russia. What diversification strategies are possible, if any, considering Mongolia's geographical position being between Russia and China? Because I think this plays a crucial role when we speak about diversification.
Right. So a question of petroleum product and oil can be challenging because of the natural endowment. Not every country has oil reserves to be independent and self-sufficient. So in that sense, Mongolia has natural oil, but the thing is, it's unrefined. Hence, it's they're not able to use it for fuel or an aviation industry. So last time I checked, majority of the petroleum products were coming from Russia, and there's an ongoing development in Mongolia's first oil refinery, which started in 2018 and which is expected to be operationalized in 2028. And this mega project is financed by Indian government's soft loan. And I have to note that Mongolia's president was in India, meeting with President Prime Minister Modi, excuse me, last week. And Prime Minister Modi emphasized that this mega project was first of its kind in a sense that it's India's first largest investment in infrastructure, energy infrastructure project in foreign soil. So it's historic. I would I would portray this development as a step towards diversification, but at the same time, um, it takes years. You know, it's year seven so far since 2018, and up until 2028, it will take some time. And having oil refinery doesn't mean you will be self-sufficient indefinitely. So in that sense, there is a development in diversification, but it's challenging. And I'm not sure if the government is considering electrification, um, transportation of electrification into the system. But at some point, there's got to be discussion about whether the country will keep getting fuel and gas from Russia in the coming few decades. But I think the conversation needs to be happened. So, policy implementation could take an effect in the coming couple of years.
Some people might logically ask if the so huge percentage of the petroleum products that's coming from Russia, is it
Right.
possible to import the same products from China and diversify that, or this is not effective or economical?
Um, I haven't had a chance to delve into possibility of Mongolia buying a petroleum product from China per se. I don't think there has been any conversation about it. Maybe there might be an independent supplier in Mongolia that buys minimal amount of fuel from China, but I don't think it's economical. I would have to double check, but there has been no conversation about, possible fuel import from China thus far. But I wonder whether there could be any conversation to, for instance, Kazakhstan or the other Central Asian countries. I mean, that could, open a discussion and there's an ongoing trade agreements between Central Asian nations as well as Mongolia and Russia. So it's an avenue to explore for future policymakers, I'd say.
And it's a very interesting research topic as well, I have to add. What about the capital? When we speak about capital, we must mention that I think it is either the coldest capital on Earth in average temperature or near this sort of scale. How would you assess the heating infrastructure and fuel shortages in the capital? How important is that Russian petroleum product coming to Mongolia because of that situation in the capital? Many people can't even imagine how it is.
But when we talk about heating, absolutely, it's the coldest capital city in the world. It reaches minus 40 Celsius during the peak winter, sometimes minus 50 some parts of the region in the country. And as you mentioned, Martin, it's heating infrastructure is very critical. And going back to history, urbanization happened in the very fastly, I would say, in the past couple of decades, because of the communist history and Soviet Union, plays a role, and a lot of infrastructure of heating as well as electricity built during that time, 1950s, 60s, 70s. And coming into a new millennium, now 2025, these existing infrastructures are very weak and old, and obviously it needs to be built freshly. But again, since it's a mega public infrastructure, depending on how much government has, its fiscal stretch, it requires significant amount of investment, I would argue. And I'm not sure if it's happening or not, but the last time I checked, there has been disruption when it comes to electricity. Last winter, for instance, the major supplier of electricity in Ulaanbaatar had to tell its customers to not to use electricity during peak hour, which is from 6 to 8, and during dinner time. It's challenging. So these developments of new infrastructures has to happen, but as you can imagine, it's only within the government's ability to finance these kind of projects. But the heating part, absolutely.
And what's about being dependent on the coal-fired appliances? Because we have some articles about people using coal for cooking in districts. Do we have any numbers? Like, for instance, this and this percentage is dependent on still on using coal during the whole winter.
Well, so when it comes to electricity mix, 85% of the electricity supply comes from coal plants. 85. So majority of the electricity is coming through coal-fired plants, and the same goes to heating system, boilers, which is fed by coal. And Ulaanbaatar, the capital city, one of the coldest capital cities in the world, as well as one of the most polluted cities when it comes to air condition because of the coal use. And it's not a brand new issue, that this crisis has been happening in the past couple of years, if not decades. And it's also, I would say, domestic political jargon in a sense. Every election cycle there comes air pollution issues as well as use of coal. But I haven't seen any substantial improvements or plan to address these. Recently, there has been a news potentially buying some sort of different type of coal from buying from China, which is to me a surprise because we have a lot of coal. But in order to reduce air pollution, they suggesting to buy different type of coal from China. And to me, these kind of serious talks need to happen because why would you buy a coal from China? It's like, can we build any manufacturing in the country to produce that, special form of coal in the country to potentially reduce? And again, I think we'll get into a whole renewable energy potential soon, but it needs to happen. Children are dying, it's very deadly for elders as well. So air pollution is one of the worrisome issues in the country.
When you speak with doctors, for instance, they tell you, I can't even show you X-ray with the healthy lungs. Like everyone has some either little issue or medium sort of healthy issue or medical condition just because of pollution. When you have the blood tests and all those medical procedures, doctors are always referring that we have to do something with the air pollution because you are breathing basically the same quality of the air, I mean quality in the brackets, for the whole winter. How would you assess the situation in different cities? Because we spoke about the capital, but what about smaller cities? What people use there for heating or cooking? How is the situation?
So it gets a little technical, I'd say, because of the geographic location of the capital city. The city is surrounded by four tall mountains. So I'm not an expert on engineering or weather, but my understanding of the situation is when you burn coal in the city to provide electricity and heating, the bad air gets trapped because of the mountains, which is very funny. So there has been some discussion about whether maybe the country should started building different cities across the country. There are other medium-sized cities such as Darhan and Ernet, but the population it's not same amount as the capital city. Half of the population in the country lives in Ulaanbaatar, and I think it's worth of discussing to even like maybe transferring the parliament and government building to a different city. That might help, but and things get quite complex when we talk about air pollution and how we move the heating and electricity infrastructure out of the city. If so, using what kind of financing, and does the government has the fund to do it? And economy plays, it's quite volatile because of the mining and dependency um, in the country. But we'll discuss more on that.
Right. Before we go to more specific questions, I must touch one topic, and that's the governance. Like, how is the
Mhm.
energy governance in Mongolia? Do you see any improvements? It's more or less stable as an energy policy and governments.
So my interpretation of the current energy security is the government doesn't have, or the current policymakers, they don't necessarily have um, a succinct policy towards achieving energy security. Um, Hence the energy governance question. Um, we talked about the difference between energy versus electricity. And I feel like oftentimes policymakers, when they argue about energy policy, they just touch on electricity issues, whether there's a disruption, whether there's a stable supply, demand. But that's not whole picture, you have to talk about gas, you have to talk about fuel, you have to talk about renewables. And I think that there is this I would argue it's like a knowledge gap when it comes to constructing succinct energy security policy. And I've seen positive developments by some policymakers. For instance, last year there was a new parliament. The number of parliament members got increased. I believe it's now 126 instead of 70. And some younger members of the parliament were arguing, energy policy needs to change, improve, it needs to be debated. So I see these as a positive development, and I believe the country is in the right direction. But these the reality of including these moving parts has to come to a good succinct energy security policy. That's what I'd say.
We had some important events regarding Power of Siberia too. And that's the infrastructure question, because many people, they read articles that Power of Siberia 2 will deliver natural gas from Russia to China through Mongolia, and Mongolia will be benefiting from this project. However, we have zero details. We have only like theoretical ideas, we have some opinions, but still the construction hasn't started. To me, it means that negotiation is still ongoing. There is no definitive agreement or bilateral agreement or trilateral agreement signed. We have memorandum, and memorandum can change. So how do you see the meaning of the Power of Siberia 2 for Mongolia? And I'm asking in two dimensions. The first dimension is as a transit, a potential benefit, and potential benefit of getting natural gas from Russia.
Depending on which side you see these new development, Power of Siberia, the new gas pipeline from northern Russia to southern China via Mongolia. I would say the message it sends to the energy scholars, global energy scholars, and dynamics. It's a message. It's significant, meaning that China decide to buy natural gas through land via Mongolia rather to get it through sea, LNG, natural liquefied gas. And because of the, instability in the Pacific, I can imagine there's a different calculation by Beijing. And then touching on war in Ukraine, Russia's willingness to push this project to get it going. And I'm not sure if your listeners know this, but the Power of Siberia 2 conversation has been happening since 2008. It's been in talks for many, many years. Um, in 2014, I believe the environmental and engineering assessment has started in Mongolia, and potential new gas pipeline topic was always in Mongolia's long-term development plan, but it was never acknowledged officially by Chinese side, which I was quite tricky. And until this day, because of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's annual meeting last month, there was finally an official piece of paper, MOU, Memorandum of Understanding. And this, I think it's symbolic. I think China is taking its time to assess whether it's like economically beneficial option to buy Russian natural gas, and it's a big infrastructure project. Mongolia, and when it comes to land size, it's vast country. It's quite cold, so I couldn't only imagine there's a logistical research needs to happen. And for Mongolia, things can look very different, whether it's a potential opportunity to have a um, extra revenue, or whether it's energy diversification, getting natural gas into the energy mix. It's awesome. It's great. Maybe technical knowledge, among domestic workers, engineers. That'd be awesome. But at the same time, it means it's more energy dependence on Russia. You're already dependent on Russian fuel, and if this new gas pipeline get operationalized, which means you would be also getting gas from Russia, and that means there is a potential interference from Russian side, from Moscow to Ulaanbaatar's domestic and foreign policy affairs, and these kind of calculation needs to be happening. And I'm not sure how policymakers see this development in a longer term, because foreign policy it's a long game.
And do you know any opinions about Power of Siberia 2
Mhm.
coming from Mongolian experts or scholars? Do they
Mhm.
do they align more as a pro project being, or do they question the project as a good project, but we need to critically assess the project to be really beneficial for Mongolia?
Mhm. Mhm. Um, I haven't seen many public policy figures commenting on this project specifically. But again, the conversation has been happening since 2008, in the past a decade or so. And there has been, some notes by some policymakers saying, it's dangerous because it's Russian gas, it's foreign infrastructure project is it's coming through our land, hence it creates potential risk. But at the same time, there are always other policymakers arguing that, but we need that revenue to diversify our state budget. Energy diversification, natural gas is a transit fuel in the age of climate emergency. So perhaps it could be one of many solutions in Ulaanbaatar's air pollution, in a sense that natural gas has less emission to pollute an environment. But at the same time, the infrastructure has to be built within the city. If so, for how long, by who, financed by who? And as Martin, you mentioned, there has been very little details about these kind of things. But I think as dynamics evolve, we shall soon see.
A natural question following up would be, does Mongolia need oil pipeline from Russia? Because some people might ask, you're building the gas pipeline, maybe, you can build this oil pipeline next to it, or something like that. Is this on the table, or is just the theoretical thoughts of some experts?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I don't think I've read or heard from anybody else whether there could be a oil pipeline from Russia. If that's the question, to where? To China? And technical aspects can play in a sense that northern China is not necessarily as most populated areas of the country. It's usually population is concentrated in the southern and coastal side. So would it make even sense to have that type of pipeline through Russia to northern China? So these kind of questions are pending, but who knows? Maybe next time we talk, we might be talking about oil pipeline.
To close that section about infrastructure, is there any energy infrastructure project that we forgot to mention and you as a researcher you consider as important to mention it?
Yeah, I would say I've been specifically paying attention to this ongoing oil refinery in Mongolia's first oil refinery in the country. And there are many emerging players in global energy dynamics, I would say, and now including in India, it's foreign. The largest foreign investment is in Mongolia. Very unassuming country you would imagine. But the question is, does Mongolia have enough oil reserve in the country to supply for a century? And as far as I know, there is not much of oil reserve, or at least that's explored or discovered. And this oil refinery, if it gets operationalized by 2028 as they plan, maybe it'll supply oil for the country for a couple of decades. But then after what? So these kind of long-term thinking has to happen among policymakers to secure, its energy calculation.
Infrastructure usually comes with investment, and as you already mentioned, Mongolia's investment strategy and position in investment is to some extent constrained by having Russia and China as neighbors. So you need some countries that can invest in Mongolia despite having basically no access to Mongolia, because Mongolia
Mhm.
is between China and Russia. How would you assess the Mongolia's energy investment strategy? And based on your research, which steps do you think that Mongolia should make to attract more energy investment?
Right. So I think there are a couple of things we should note when we talk about investment towards energy, because so energy for who, for instance? So if does it benefit to that private company if that private company were to invest in some renewable energy projects in Mongolia? Because who are the end users, and is there going to be a profit? And many developing countries in the world, Mongolia, and the central energy infrastructure is run by the government. So I can only imagine the incentive towards, private sectors, willingness to invest in, public sectors, energy infrastructure. So that's to me, that's a little confusing. But as a climate emergency impacting many parts of the world, and Mongolia is one of them, desertification, it's a big issue. And extreme weather events like very harsh winter or a very hot summer, it really impacts the countries with nomadic living, as well as its calculation towards what kind of energy security policy it takes. I have observed in the past couple of years there has been a willingness towards, for instance, European Union to invest in renewable energy projects, or many renewable energy projects in Ulaanbaatar city, where the informal areas, they have, solar panel on their roof and get the electricity rather than burning a coal in a stove. So I've seen many a minimal project, I would say, but again, at the end of the day, less than 10% of the electricity mix comes from renewable energy. So how scalable is that in a coming couple of decades? And there has been shift in global energy governance, how the largest investors talk about, whether it's worth of investing in developing world. Um, so there are many things to talk about, but at the end of the day, it's quite complex issue. That's my answer.
And I think it's also very, very good that you mentioned that because imagine that I am American investor and I can invest in solar power plant. But then when you say that it's only 10%, who is going to pay for electricity coming from my project? And I think
Right.
this is the question which might be sort of barrier for many investors that they would invest, but as you rightly mentioned, the state ownership of the infrastructure and the percentage of people, for instance, in this case, when we mention renewables, it's it's okay, but it would take maybe what 70 years to have my investment back if I count that only 10% of population is on the renewable sources. And maybe it will be better in the future, but still the transition is very slow. And even in the very rich European Union, you see how the transition is slow. And we still depend on the gas, we still depend on oil and many fossil fuels. So I think this is, as you rightly mentioned, very, very good point. What about the domestic investment? Are there any, let's say, rich companies or are there any state incentives for the local businesses to invest in either renewable energy or energy projects in general?
If I may correct you, it's like 10% of the energy mix, electricity comes from renewable energy. So, as we discussed before, the electricity still comes from coal-fired fire plants. But on that note, on domestic incentives, so government has a long-term development plan called Vision 2050. And one of their aspirational agenda is to become energy exporter. So, but what kind? And they mentioned about renewables, and they goes on. Mongolia has abundance in solar and wind. Great, awesome. But how do we actually get the project done and get the electricity going? And it's one of those areas where it also gets technical in a sense that it's one of the least sparsely populated country in the world. So, vast land, few people, and underdeveloped infrastructure. So even if you were able to put, millions of solar, panels in the country, do you have a transmission lines to transmit that to your end user? If so, who's going to pay for that transmission line? The solar, sun doesn't shine 24/7. So what happens during the night? You need some type of container, a big amount of batteries. If so, who's going to pay for that battery and how do we get that? Yes, there's been changes. Yes, the prices of these renewable energy infrastructures has been declining in the past couple of years, but these kind of technical problems can be um, consideration for many investors, I would say. And the same goes to the country's policymakers because they are other pressing priorities. Maybe it's poverty, maybe it's education, maybe it's healthcare. So how do you define the line between this amount of investment needs to happen and it should come from domestic state budget versus foreign donors? If so, what kind of foreign donors? Yeah, I mentioned the EU and Japan is one of the largest donors when it comes to renewable energy projects as well as development projects. It can be that, but there are many moving parts, I would say.
Yeah, and I think also we should mention China because we mentioned Russia, we mentioned India, and what about China as a big neighbor, as a country that is having Belt and Road Initiative and many other infrastructure projects? Do you see any direct energy investment coming from China?
I think it's very possible cooperation between two governments because China is the leading supplier when it comes to renewable energy infrastructure. So there has been some feasibility research whether, they could build scalable solar energy or wind energy capacity in Mongolia and potentially export that excess energy to China, northern China. But again, these kind of research, sorry, it is still in its feasibility studies, but maybe some push can come from Mongolian side or Chinese side in a sense that because of climate emergency, these kind of talks need to be happening along with, trade talks, along with, mining industry, along with other foreign policy priorities. But I haven't heard anything on that note. But I think it's very promising topic between two countries.
I know that in the past, when I was researching Mongolia, China, Russia, there was a discussion about East Asia power grid,
Right.
connecting more countries together. But for some reason, I haven't come back to this topic. So can you please update me if this is still relevant or it's the question of the past?
Right. I think there is an still ongoing study by Asian Development Bank. Um, I believe the study began in around mid 2014, 2015, maybe 2018. It's been ongoing, but still it's in a feasibility study phase. And like any mega project, and we kind of discussed about this. What about transmission lines? What about under existing infrastructure, whether to how to transport that energy to China? So these are very technical engineering questions, I would say. And I wonder there has been a push from Mongolian side to go along with these. And there are many energy insecure countries in the region, such as Japan and South Korea. So I wonder this potential Northeast Asian power grid thing can be, you know, very rational area where countries in the region oftentimes, see each other as adversaries, can come together and share this opportunity when it comes to energy policy. Um, but as far as I know, the phase of this potential project has been quite slow, but perhaps maybe push should come from one of either sides engaging in this conversation.
When we speak about investment and infrastructure, we can't forget on energy poverty,
Mhm.
especially in some villages, rural areas, or outside the big cities. What can you say about the situation in Mongolia regarding this topic? And where can you see some sort of steps for improvements or some process that might improve the situation?
Right. And I was just doing some research, but came across this number which I wasn't expecting. So in the capital city Ulaanbaatar, um, 60% of the population, 60% of the population lives in informal district area or known as GARE areas. 60%. So 60% of the population in the capital city is not necessarily connected to centralized infrastructure, whether it's water system or electricity or hygiene. So to me that was shocking. It's when it comes to numbers, it's 850,000 people doesn't have, doesn't connect it to centralized water system or electricity. And hence the problem of, having their own independent coal running stove to have heating during the harsh cold winter or, generate electricity. And to me, it needs to change. And government has so many priorities, such as, whether to pursue these kind of mega and energy infrastructure projects or, elevating poverty, education. But it's one of those developing country dilemma where, where to start, where to invest smartly, which one can benefit, if you do cost benefit analysis, which one can benefit the country the most. And it's it's very complex problem as I see it. And but there has been some creative solutions on the energy development side. I mentioned about this having solar panels on the roof, and I believe it's financed or either partnered by World Bank, UNDP and European Union. So I've seen those pilot programs taking places in those informal care district area where maybe those families could self-sustain when it comes to energy needs and heating needs. And I think it's great, it's awesome. But I don't think is it solution for this energy poverty in the country? No, but it's something creative and there's something going on. And obviously the bigger, more succinct discussion needs to happen on that note.
And I think this also puts us to a level of solving the questions holistically, like the development of the flats, development of the grid infrastructure altogether. Because I can imagine that you will build Power of Siberia too. So there is a big pipeline going on. You can get the gas, but how you will transfer the gas from the pipeline to the user, the end user. So that's I think question for the Mongolian government to solve out. Let's speak a little bit about the impact of the climate change. How can you assess the climate change impact on Mongolia's energy security? In which areas you see the movement or dynamics, and in which areas you see not much happening?
Mhm. So on the climate change aspect, I'm not an expert, but this is my understanding of the situation where um, Mongolia has a large desert, Gobi Desert. If I'm not mistaken, it's one of the largest deserts in the world, Gobi Desert. And the impact of climate change can take many different forms. For instance, during the winter, it can be very, very cold, hence harsh. And since the traditional way of living is nomadic life and, having herders, many cows and horses and camels, goats, it can look, you know, herders, they can claim many losses during those harsh winters and which threatens the food security, to be frank with you. And on the energy security front, I would imagine there's a opportunity to use that sun, having those solar panels, maybe in the Gobi Desert area. But at the same time, it kind of threatens the water supply because desertification means less plants, less greens, and less water. So I wonder how it could impact in ongoing hydropower projects, for instance. Um, and then I think this problem of like how climate change could impact existing infrastructure system, it's not unique to Mongolia. Maybe during extreme hot weather, I can imagine like how the transmission lines, like how much heat it could tolerate, is it gonna melt? And I'm sure many researchers are focusing on this, but this is how I understand the situation.
What's about the human energy capital in Mongolia? I'm speaking about the people who are dealing with energy research, people who are directly involved in energy production, transition, everything. Is there any research or is there any study how Mongolia is developing this part of the energy security? Because we know energy security on a paper, and then we need people for energy
Mhm.
security.
Yeah, absolutely. So oftentimes my take on this issue is since energy projects or existing energy infrastructure has been quite neglected by the central government, there goes the stipend and pay for, people who are working in the same industry. And perhaps if the current government thinks that it's something worth of investing in, maybe there should be an increase in wages for those engineers who's running those heating and coal-fired power plants, because it takes some brain power, I can imagine, to run those old ones specifically that needs to get, released and expired. But I can only imagine, they wouldn't, it's not very attractive industry to get into for many young people. And perhaps there should be a pilot program um, that could attract young talents towards this energy infrastructure or policy area. But thus far, the government hasn't doing much. It's been insufficient, and focus. I, I I don't think it has changed, but obviously something needs to get changed because energy security and calculation it's fundamental to national security, how you run the country, in a longer term.
Yeah, and also if we think logically, it doesn't matter which government; each government needs energy. So even when people are politically divided and there is sort of division in Mongolia, I think energy should penetrate both camps or all political parties because no matter which party is in power, they still need energy for all sectors, from military to agriculture. So I think therefore this topic might be very interesting, I think, for all people to research. One of the questions I have about energy security is also connected to national debt. And I know that Mongolia is not doing well when it comes to national debt because of many reasons. And one of the reasons is income. Mongolia needs income to pay off the debt.
Mhm.
How serious is that question or that issue when we speak about energy security?
Right. I think when we touch on national debt issue, we have to look into greater wellness of economy. And we know that, for instance, 1/3 of the state budget comes from mining sector. Almost close to 30% of GDP comes from mining sector, and which is highly dependent on China. So export that goes to China, 65% of them is coking coal or metallurgical coal, which is used for steel production, and some 18% is copper. So Mongolia's little economy and its mining sector is dependent on one country, which happened to be China. And depending on your inflation level, unemployment level, things can look very differently. And since the economy is so prone for market disruption, whether it's China's steel industry or whether it's a market price for coking coal or copper, um, it's challenging for the government to make a long-term plan, hence investment. Will you have that amount of money by this amount of year? Um, and then debt issue. Um, if your economy is not diversified and your source of income is heavily dependent on mining export to China, and inflation level is high, your currency is getting depreciated, how are you able to pay your interest rate when it comes to national debt? And sure, in the past couple of years, creating sovereign wealth fund using those mining revenues, um, it's some solution, but I think, you know, I think the conversation is way bigger than just national debt. It's about, having economic development that's sustainable and diversified enough to withstand those market disruptions or, external nations' steel sector.
When I was teaching in Scotland and we spoke about Mongolia, one
Mm,
student had a question. I think I can give you the same question. He asked about the difference between African countries and
mm,
Mongolia when it comes to
mhm,
mining sector. He was
mhm,
thinking in dimension that in Africa they have everything, gold, diamonds, oil, gas,
mhm,
whatever. But still the population doesn't benefit. And he
mhm,
asked, is Mongolia a similar sort of country, or is there a similar principle in Mongolia?
mhm. I think it's an apples and orange type of comparison, if I may say that. Um, for instance, in I saw this graph where, like, the most mining dependent countries in the world. The first one was DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and the third one was Mongolia. I don't remember the other countries, but I thought, well, there you go, one African nation and in Mongolia. And to me, when we talk about economics and poverty and level of living for average citizen, there are many different moving parts, including governance. Some African nations, it's very unstable. Perhaps those mining projects are run by militia groups. You don't know. It varies whether the actual central government is benefiting from those mining operations or whether it's a power group that's concentrating in the southern part of the country. So I think it's very apples and orange type of situation, and thankfully, Mongolia has a stable government, even though the prime minister just resigned last week. But I think it's just internal dynamic. I think it's very unfortunate, but I don't think it's shocking development on that note. But when it comes to mining, you cannot be dependent on mining industry in a longer term if you want sustainable development, because by default, your state income is dependent on market and external buyers. And mining can be very tricky in a sense that it's not manufacturing. So is it creating innovation? Is it creating a development in the country? So these kind of questions, all parts of this complex their issue, but I wouldn't compare the situation regarding mining between Africa and Mongolia.
What would you recommend to strengthen the Mongolia's energy security as a researcher? And you might have some ideas about investment, maybe some ideas about the regulation or regulatory framework or energy policy. But let's pretend that you are the Prime Minister of Mongolia today. What sort of steps would you implement in that power?
Mhm. I would say, energy security it's not isolated part of policy. So if I were to be a high level policymaker in Mongolia, I think, energy security and economic security front both can go. So, revenue generated by economy can get invested into energy aspects. So I would say I would probably have multiple agendas on that note. But going back to infrastructure part, it's actually like very immediate risk for end users, people in Ulaanbaatar. So investing in that new infrastructure has to be priority, in my opinion, for the policymakers. And a diversification part. We talked about renewable energy a lot, but can we scale it and can we get it into the system and electricity mix beyond that 10% as it is right now? As well as a cooperation between, other stakeholders like China. Could we have some kind of deal to purchase, substantial amount of renewable energy infrastructure from China, because countries, they have quite close relationship. I think it's something that's possible. And could we create a succinct, very in-depth energy security policy which covers all these? Because talking one side, doing this, without a general plan, it can be quite easy to get diverted into different loophole. And could we make sure, there's enough investment going towards these kind of critical infrastructure beyond, domestic politics? And these conversation could take side next to economic diversification, as we've been talking. Can we really depend on mining industry in the future? Because my answer would be no. Climate change is happening. I don't think China will be the receiving country for Mongolian mining products. So is there any external market? If so, how, can we actually add value into those manufacturing mining products and get it, something nice into the world market? And then we have to talk about trade. So it's a lot of things, Martin, I would say.
Yeah, I think I quite like your holistic approach because I think this is quite needed in Mongolia. The last question for today's interview. We have viewers, we have researchers, junior researchers who might be interested in Mongolia's energy security. You have been in this topic for some time already. Which areas of research or under-research areas would you recommend for them to have a look, or perhaps something that you work on and they can join you in some ideas or theorizing?
I think there are many different interesting areas that involves Mongolian energy security, but for me, um, if you're somebody who has technical and engineering background, I would try to look into more renewable energy side because I believe renewable energy should be future for Mongolia beyond natural gas as a transit fuel or beyond coal, beyond having coal plants. So renewable energy, I would look into that. And it's an evolving industry in a sense that I was just reading about this Financial Times report on, batteries, the storage system in the past few years, it has increased by so much. So it would be interesting to see in coming couple of years how the renewable energy infrastructure and transmission lines could change back in Mongolia, whether it would be scalable enough to sustain, big part of Mongolia's energy mix.
Telman, many thanks for sharing your research insight with us, your opinion. You represent a young generation of researchers with fresh perspectives on Mongolia, so I was very happy that you found some time for IR Thinker. And I also wish you good luck and lots of energy to your research, publications that we are reading and citing. And again, thank you very much for being on IR Thinker.
Thank you very much, Martin. It's been my pleasure, and I'm looking forward to engaging more of discussions later. Thank you.
Thank you.